This tutorial takes you from simple positions to more complex strategic situations in 10 levels.
At each level, you demonstrate mastery of the concepts by answering a challenge question, where you make the move you think is the correct answer. There are more than 200 positions in all. Use this building block method at your own pace. As a beginner, you can learn basics. As you advance, you can learn multi-move combinations. You can also use Chess Tutor as a refresher course over time, since the positions are interesting as well as instructional. What is checkmate? What is stalemate? What is Zugzwang? Start with this most basic checkmate. The rooks can only delay checkmate 2 more moves with rook b8 and rook c8. The rooks and bishops can only delay checkmate 4 more moves. What single move can white make to force mate on the following move? Mate in 2. Correct. The correct move is 1 rook g1, king e8, 2 rook g8, checkmate. A pawn mate. A knight mate. Either bishop or rook can mate. 1 bishop b2 checkmate or 1 rook g8 checkmate. How does white mate? Correct. A mate often depends on forcing the opponent to make a move. Sometimes you simply wait. 1 rook b7, king f8. 2 king e6, king g8. The black king can no longer run away. 3 king f6, king h8. 4 king g6, king g8. 5 rook b8, checkmate. The same procedure lets white push the opponent back another rank. 1 rook b6, king f7, 2 king e5, etc. What is the fastest mate for white? Correct. The correct sequence is to advance the king on the diagonal, since black's best defense is to move toward b8. Now, by losing a move, white can bring about the basic mating sequence in the previous positions. 1 rook h7, king e8. 2 rook b7, king d8. 3 rook a7. Being forced to move when you would rather not is called Zugzwang. Here, white forces black to move a pawn when black would be safe without moving. 1 knight g4 h2, 2 knight f2 checkmate. If white could wait, it could mate. But after 1 knight g3 check king h2, 2 knight f1 check king h1, white has no waiting move, and black draws. If it's black's move, it's stalemate. If white moves 1 king f6 d6, king d7 f7, black loses. What is the opposition? What are pawn advantages? What is the square? In pawn endings, move the king in front of the passed pawn. 1 king e6, king d8 f8, 2 king f7 d7, and the pawn has a paved road to a queen. No matter who moves first, it's a draw. If it is white's move, 1 king f6, king f8, 2 e7 check, king e8. Draw as shown already. Black to move would play 1 king e7. White must either stalemate the king or lose the pawn. White must choose between d6 and d5 to attack the enemy pawn. One king d6, king f4, 2 king d5, and black must leave its pawn. The opposition means being in a position to make the other king step aside. 1 king d4, king c6, e6, 2 king e5, c5, winning a pawn. How does white win? The right idea is to advance to b7 and win the 2 black pawns. If the white king's path is blocked, an outside passed pawn, f4, can open it. 1 f5, check, king f6, 2 king d5, and white wins. Unlike the backward pawn at a7, white's f3 pawn can move, so you can arrive at the preceding position. 1 f4, g takes f4, 2 g takes f4. White gets a protected passed pawn if black played 1 g4 in the previous position. If black plays king takes g3, then white can play f5 and go on to queen. The white pawn at b5 is isolated and can be won if not protected by the white king. If 1 king takes b5, 2 f5, king c6 stops the white pawn. But if black had played 2 king c5, black can stop the pawn only if the pawn advances alone. The white pawn is lost. The white king now supports the pawn to the queening square with 4 king f5, king d7, 5 king g6. The square formed by the diagonal c5 f8 is the area the black king must get into to stop the pawn at f5. Sometimes just getting into the square is not good enough. In this position, because of the white king, 1 king c6 is the right way. 1 king c5 is wrong. If 1 king c6, 2 f6 king d7, 3 king f5 king e8, the black king gains the square f8. Here, white must watch the square formed by the diagonal b1 d3. If 1 f5 check king f6, 2 king f4 a4, 3 b takes a4 b3, then black can queen. If it's black's move, 1 a4, 2 b takes a4 b3, 3 king d3, and white wins the pawn. Can you identify the following? 1. Two isolated pawns. 2. A protected passed pawn. 3. A backward pawn. The isolated pawns are b3 and g4. The protected passed pawn is f4. The backward pawn is a5. When both sides promote to queen, special king positions, how the rook attacks and defends. Black's only chance is to attack the g3 pawn. 1 king e4, 2 king b2, king f3, 3 f5 king takes g3, 4 f6 king h2, 5 f7 g3, 6 f8 queen g2. Can white stop the pawn? One queen f2 king h1, 2 queen h4 check king g1, 3 king c2. White systematically drives the king in front of the pawn, and the white king keeps moving closer. But what if it's a black pawn on the f or c file? Black has a stalemate defense. 1. Queen e2, king h1. 2. Queen takes f2, stalemate. What if the white king tries to approach? 2 king b2, king g1. Of course, this was possible on the first move too. 3 queen g4 check king h1. 4 queen h3 check king g1. 5 queen g3 check king h1. Black avoids king f1 and white can make no progress. Even if black moves first and queens first, white queens with check, skewering the king and queen. 1 h5, 2 a4 h4, 3 a5 h3, 4 a6 h2, 5 a7 h1 queen, 6 a8 queen check, and 7 queen takes h1. White to move doesn't queen with check, but has a similar skewer to follow. 1 b4 h5, 2 b5 h4, 3 b6 h3, 4 b7 h2, 5 b8 queen h1 queen, 6 queen b7 check, and 7 queen takes h1. Sometimes it takes another check to set up the skewer. 1 b4 h5, 2 b5 h4, 3 b6 h3, 4 b7 h2, 5 b8 queen h1 queen, 6 queen g8 check king h4, 7 queen h7, 8 check, and 8 queen takes h1. In a few cases, the black pawn cannot be captured before queening, yet is thereafter defenseless to protect against mate. 1 king e4, c1 queen, 2. King d3, queen f4. 3. Queen c2, check, king e1. 4. Queen e2, checkmate. How does black draw? Correct. One, king b4. Black draws not with 1 c1 queen, 2 c8 queen check, but with 1 king b4 c4, 2 c8 queen, king b3, and the black king can't be prevented from getting to a1 with the stalemate position. How the rook helps a pawn to queen. 1. Rook c8, g2. 2. Rook takes f8, check, king g7. 3. Rook g8, check. Simplest to end all opposition. 3. King takes g8. 4. b8, queen, check. And 5. Queen g3. For the defense, note how black must get behind, not in front of, the pawn. 1. Rook b4. Not 1 rook g7, 2 rook c2, 3 rook c7. The rook can also cut off the enemy king's approach. The white king can support the pawn's advance. 1. Rook f2, rook e4, trying to cut off the white king. 2. b6, rook e6. 3. Rook b2, but not 3 b7, rook a6 check, and 4 rook b6 check, winning the pawn. The rook sometimes can take advantage of being in front of the pawn if the rook can check safely or set up a skewer, such as 1. Rook h8, rook takes b7, 2. Rook h7 check, and 3. Rook takes b7. Or the rook can give up the pawn to win additional material. 1. Rook g8, rook takes b7, 2. Rook takes g7 check, and 3. Rook takes g5. If the king can avoid checks, the pawn will queen. 1. King g7, rook g2 check. 2. King f6. The white rook can also build a bridge to end checks when the rook can't get behind the pawn. 1. Rook e4, king d7. 2. Rook d4 check, king c6. 3. King e7, rook e2 check. 4. King f6, rook f2 check. 5. King g6, rook g2 check. 6. King f5, rook f2 check. 7. Rook f4 wins. This is the Lucena position. How does white win? The rook must get to b8. 1. Rook c1 or h1. King e7. 2. Rook c8, king d7. 3. Rook b8. After a number of checks, the king will escape to c5. Not 2 rook c7 check, king d6, 3 rook b7, rook h2, and 4 king b8, rook h8 checkmate. One bishop d8 wins, as the bishop cuts off the rook from the queening square. One knight f7 check, king g7, 2 knight d8 wins, whereas 1 c8 queen wins the rook, but only draws.
The knight is a surprisingly good defender against a pawn about to queen. Black's move 1 knight d5, 2 c8 promotes to queen, knight b6 check, and 3 knight takes c8.
It's difficult to drive a knight away from the queening square. 1 king c5, king g8, 2 king b6, king h8, 3 king c7, king g8, 4 knight d8, knight e5, and 5 knight takes d7. The knight alone can prevent king and pawn from queening safely. One knight b5, not 1 knight e4, 2 king e6, followed by 3 king e5 winning. 2 king e6, otherwise knight d6 check, 2 knight c7 check, 3 king d6. If 3 king d7, knight d5 wins the pawn because of knight f6 check, 3 knight e8 check, 4 king d7, knight f6 check, draw. This strategy will not work with an enemy rook pawn because the knight cannot move on both sides of the pawn. The bishop can be driven from the queening square, unlike the knight. 1 bishop e6, bishop a6, 2 king d8, king f8, 3 bishop c8, bishop e2, 4 bishop b7, bishop g4, 5 bishop c6, followed by bishop d7. But the knight is sometimes vulnerable on the back rank. 1 b7, bishop d4 check, 2 king d2, not 2 king takes d4, knight a7, 3 king c5, knight c6, 4 king takes c6, bishop e4 check. The pawn has 2 queening squares after the correct move to king d2. Can black, on the move, stop the pawn? Show how. Correct. The bishop can stop the pawn with 1 bishop f8, 2 a7, bishop c5 check, but not 1 bishop h6, 2 king f2. The bishop is a dominating force against an inactive knight. 1 bishop d5. The knight is trapped and will be won by the king. The 2 bishops are deadly on an open board. 1 bishop e1, knight f3, 2 bishop f5 check, winning a piece. In closed positions, with the knight on a safe square and the opposing bishop on the same color as the pawns, the knight is often dominant. 1c3 waiting. Even though black is a pawn up, black must now either lose a pawn by moving the bishop, or allow the white king to advance by moving the king. A typical sequence might be 1 king b6, 2 king d5, king b5, 3 king e6, winning. How does white win? Correct. Did you get 1 c7, knight d5, not 1 knight d7, 2 king b5, a5? 2 g8, queen, check. King takes g8, 3 bishop c4. The knight has the power to fork, the bishop to pin. Note that 1 g8 queen check is wrong, because of knight takes g8. 2 c7, knight e7. Major piece mates, minor piece mates, with pins and double checks. One of the basic checkmates in the opening, shown without the rest of the white force. The move queen h5 check, or queen h4 check by black, is always dangerous when the f-pawn is moved, even more so when the g-pawn is also moved. In schematic form, another basic checkmate in the opening. Although it's overly optimistic to aim for this mate in the first few moves, it often occurs as a threat when 1 queen f3 or 1 queen h5 also attacks a black piece, a double threat. Against the castle black king, this is a similar common threat, or checkmate as here. Note that if a black pawn were at g7, the king would have a flight at f7. A white knight at g5 also supports the same checkmate. Note that black has two common defenses to this type of mate. If the queen is at h5, threatening 2 queen h7 checkmate. 1 knight f6, guarding h7, or 1 rook f6, giving the king a flight at f8. Note that 1 rook d8 fails because of 2 queen f7 check and 3 queen h7 checkmate. Advancing the g-pawn creates many threats against the castled king, especially if it reaches g6. 1 queen h3 check, king g8. 2 queen h7 checkmate. There are 5 ways to prevent the threatened checkmate at h7. You are black. What move also attacks a white piece? Correct. The correct move is 1 knight f6, which attacks the bishop at d3. Another strong mating alliance is the queen and bishop teaming up on the long diagonal. The typical defenses are moving bishop or queen to f8. The queen performs many elegant checkmates because of her ability to control flight squares. This mate is called the epaulette mate if it occurs toward the center of the board with another black rook next to the king. This check occurs often, if only as a threat, when the king castles on the queen side. Castling queenside is considered more risky than on the king side because of greater territory to defend on the A file. Doubled rooks are more than twice as powerful as two rooks operating independently. On rank 7, their natural home because that's where the enemy pawns are, rooks that are doubled often threaten this mate. When the rooks undouble, they usually catch the king in this clean mate. Sacrifices clearing away the pawns at g7 and h7 are aimed at this type of checkmate. Can you find a winning move for white? Correct. Full points for 1 rook b7, which mates next move. 1 rook a8, 2 rook h8, checkmate. Moves like 1 rook c7 or 1 rook fg7 are answered by 1 king d8 or king f8. Control of the long diagonal by a bishop leads to many types of mates. This one is elegant. 1 knight h6 checkmate, not 1 knight e7 check king f7. A famous knight mate, the smothered. White has a choice of mates here. You already saw 1 queen h5 checkmate. But isn't the smothered mate prettier? 1 knight d6 checkmate. Note the pin of the e-pawn. Another example of a splashy mate on a queenside castled king. Bishops multiply in value with the extra space of the A file. A mate that's repeated in many areas of the board. This arrangement of the bishops is the closest equivalent to the doubling of the rooks. Bishops and knights sometimes perform heroically together. What would you do as white? Correct. In schematic form, this is the famous Legal's mate. It emphasizes the vulnerability of f7 or f2 for white. With a white knight at c3, it's a spectacular mate. 1 bishop f7 check king e7, 2 knight d5 checkmate. Rook and minor pieces collaborate frequently in mates. The knight's magic square is f6, or f3, c6, c3. Bishop and rook are especially dangerous with the bishop on the famous long diagonal. The fianchettoed bishop at b2, b7, g7, or g2 is the easiest way for a bishop to control this diagonal. The minor pieces often collaborate with double checks, a chief feature of which is that no enemy piece can interpose. If there are no king flights, it's mate, as here, 1 bishop g5, checkmate. In a discovered check, the leading piece, here the knight, can often perform other duties. In this case, the knight shuts off the black pawn. 1 knight e6, checkmate. How does white use a discovered check to win or mate? The correct promotion is 1 f8, knight, checkmate, a double check. The double check with promotion to a queen is murderous. 1 f8, queen, checkmate. Note that all double checks are the result of line openings or discoveries. The king's position is often fatally weakened by a pin. 1 queen takes g6, check. This idea occurs frequently because the bishop is often developed on the a2, g8 diagonal against a fianchettoed bishop. Bishop developed at g7 here, but then traded off. Just when everything seems protected, a pawn slips into mate. 1 g7, checkmate. Pawns often mate when the enemy king is driven to the other side of the board. It seems there are many ways to checkmate, but note that when the queen checks adjacent to the enemy king, only 2 additional squares must be guarded. 2 squares of the opposite color of the mating square. 1 queen h4, checkmate. The queen check at f5 leaves h6 unguarded. The queen check at g6 leaves f4 unguarded. What's the fastest way to checkmate? Correct. The black king seems to have many escapes, but a single move mates him in the open board. 1 queen e7, checkmate. Forks and skewers, double attacks, pseudo combinations. The basic combinations all involve a double attack as the payoff. They often start with a double threat. Here, white is saved with a simple fork. 1 e4, check. In simplest terms, the king and the rook can't both move at the same time. Here, white has the luxury of 2 forks. The rook double attack is also called a skewer, a name that's more vivid when a bishop catches 2 enemy pieces on a diagonal. 1 knight d4, check. Or 1 rook h5, check, winning the queen. The king is a fighting piece in the ending because it double attacks well. 1 king c6, rook a7, 2 king b6. In this famous endgame study by Richard Reti, the white king can't get in the square of the black pawn, formed by the diagonal d5, h1, but he can't simultaneously threaten to get in the square and to support his own pawn. One king g7 h4, 2 king f6. First threat. If the pawn moves again, then 3 king e6 7 forces the white pawn to queen. 2 king b6, 3 king e5. Second threat. 4 king d6 again threatens to mobilize the pawn. 3 king takes c6, and now 4 king f4, and white is in the square. Pawn forks are common in the opening as a way of exchanging center pawns or reducing pressure.
Black's move 1, knight takes e4. 2, knight takes e4, d5, forking the pieces and winning one back. Note that white can also give up a piece at once, with b takes e6 check. It's a question of which pawn white wants to win back.
The black queen has just checked at a5, apparently forking both the bishop at a4 and the knight at d5. These are pseudo-forks, since 1c3 is a double defense against the check and loss of the bishop, and 1 knight c3 is a triple defense, blocking the check, removing the knight from capture, and guarding the bishop. Another pseudo-fork. 1 king d4 apparently forks the rooks, but the defense is easy. 1 rook, either, e5. The white bishop has apparently forked knight and rook. Black could play 1 knight e5 defending the rook, but even better, so as not to lose the exchange, rook for minor piece, is 1 rook f6.
Some forks are very fragile indeed. First, black might try 1 knight g5 check, 2 king h4, knight f3 check, 3 king g3, and the fork holds.
But 1 knight f2 check in turn forks the king and pawn. Or 1 rook c3 pins and wins the poor pawn. Black's queen and rook are forked. How does black defend? Correct. The right idea is 1 queen g3, which is both attack and defense. If 2 queen takes g3, rook takes g3, removes everything from attack. But not 1 rook g3 because of another white fork. 2 takes c7, rook takes a3, 3 knight b5 check. All good moves contain more than one element. Immediate threats, immediate defenses, or threats of either. Here white threatens the half-pin pieces or forks with 2 b5 check. Black defends by a move that unpins the bishop and avoids the pawn fork. 1 king b7, 2 rook takes e6, bishop d5. Now white is pinned. Note that 1 bishop d5 at once loses to a further attack on the knight, 2 f5. Sharp tactics require experience, or a computer-like search of all 3-4 move variations. Here white is forked, but holds on with short threats. 1 king e4, rook a3, 1 knight takes g6 draws, 2 rook f6 check, king g8, not 2 knight b5, rook a4 check, 3 h7 check, king h8, 4 rook f8 check, forces him to take at h7 and lose the knight to the fork 5 rook f7 check. Put this all in a game situation. 1 bishop takes b5 happens all the time in positions like this. The black queen is partially pinned and then forked after 1 queen takes b5, 2 knight c7 check. It's a royal check if queen, king, and rook are all somewhere in the knight's wheel. After 2 moves in the opening, king's gambit, white is the victim of a typical fork. 3 queen h4 check, 4 king e2, queen takes e4 check, or if 4 g3, queen takes e4 check, black wins the rook. A common opening situation. How should white play? Correct. 1 queen h5 check is the right start. What about 1 g6? You are right if you saw 2 knight takes g6. The h-pawn is pinned, so that 2 h takes g6, 3 queen takes h8. If 2 knight f6, the queen can either retreat to h4, keeping the pin, or gain a move with 3 queen e5 check, after which white wins the rook. Pinned pieces, overworked pieces, restricted mobility. This is the schematic of a common opening pin, designed to keep the black king from castling. 1 bishop g5 is met by f6, but white may be able to play 1 bishop a3 to win the pinned piece. Act on a pinned piece quickly. Here white could try to double up with 1 rook d3 threatening rook fd1, but then black escapes with king e7. 1 rook fe1 check, king d8 also lets black get unpinned, but 1 rook takes d7, knight takes d7, 2 rook d1 gets the piece. Black has just taken at e4. This schematic shows when a pin wins and when it doesn't in this typical opening. 1. Queen e2, Queen e7 defends successfully, but 2. Rook e1, d5, 3 f3 wins the piece for a pawn. Sometimes the pinning piece gets pinned. 1. Kingside castle, Queen takes e5, 2. Rook e1. How does White take advantage of the pinned bishop at e7? Correct. At most, White can disrupt the kingside pawns with 1. Bishop g5, f6, 2. Bishop f4, when White threatens 2 queenside pawns and can check on the a2 g8 diagonal when Black castles. The idea of keeping the Black king in the center with 1. Queen e2 backfires after 1. Kingside castle, 2. Queen takes e7, Rook ae8. Now the queen is pinned by the mate that would occur after 3. Queen takes d7, Rook takes e1, checkmate. Ideally, the rooks are developed on the central files where they pose threats to the opposing queen and king. White's lead in development allows 1. Knight b5 since the c6 pawn is pinned. 1. Queen takes e5 is out because of the common pin. 2. Rook e1. White's knight will check at d6, keeping the king from castling. White pins and wins the c5 pawn with 1. Queen a3, Rook a8, 2. Knight a4, h6, 3. Queen takes c5, both attacks and defends. On 3. Queen takes c5, 4. Knight takes c5, not d takes c5. A schematic of a typical kingside pin. 1. g4 appears to win the knight because of 1. Knight f4, 2. Rook h8, checkmate. But the knight can defend with 1. Knight g7. After 2. Bishop f6, the knight is pinned along the diagonal, and the kingside is immobilized. White wins a piece for the a pawn with 1. Rook c8, but loses the game after 1. h2. A pin forces the queening of a pawn. One, Rook c4, h2, 2. Rook takes e4, check, f takes e4, 3. a8, promote to queen, h1, promote to queen, 4. Queen h8, check, wins. The rook is strong against two minor pieces when they have limited safe haven in the endgame. 1. Rook c1. If the knight goes to the a or e file, Rook a1 or Rook e1 wins it, due to the direct pin on the e file and the threat of mate if the knight moves off the a file. Does white win the e4 pawn by pinning the defending knight with 1 bishop g5? How would you respond for black? Correct. The pin is illusory. 1 bishop g5, knight takes d5, attacking and defending at the same time. 2 knight takes d5, bishop takes g5, 3 knight takes c7, rook a c8, where the rook skewers the knight and c2 pawn. Best is 2 bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, 3 knight takes e4 with an even game. Obviously, a pinned piece is immobilized. Indirectly, an overworked piece is also hobbled. 1 knight takes d5. The knight at b6 cannot defend both c4 and d5 in this schematic. The black pieces seem to be working together, but the queen is actually overworked. 1 queen takes c6, and all of a sudden the twice-guarded rook at d8 is unguarded after 1 queen takes c6, 2 rook takes d8, checkmate. Note that white must avoid the black queen after 1 rook takes d2 and mate with 2 queen e8 checkmate, or be mated.
The knight at f6 is the king's best defender, but is overworked by the simple fork. 1 knight e8, knight takes e8. 2 queen takes h7, checkmate. As on other moves, 2 knight takes f6 check, mate's next move.
A weak back rank must be defended along its length. Hence the number of combinations based on pieces overworked in its defense, 1 queen a4. White chooses this square carefully, since white now threatens 2 queen takes a7, in response, for example, to 1 queen b7. 1 bishop f5 allows 2 rook takes c8 check, followed by 3 queen takes a7. Black has an overworked piece. Show how white can take advantage of it. Correct. After 1 knight d4, the black queen must guard both the bishop at f5 and the mate at d8. The rook must move to avoid 2 queen takes d2. The key move introduces the idea of cutting a line, the file d7 d2. For if 1 e takes d4, 2 queen takes d2 wins the exchange, knight for rook. Pawns are great for cutting lines, since they are expendable. Here 1 d4 shuts off the black queen and threatens 2 mates. 1 g takes h5 allows 2 rook g1 check and mate next. The rook, knight, or bishop can cut a line along the back rank to help a pawn to queen. See Tutorial Level 4. Here the rook cuts a file with 1 rook b5, a common theme in the endgame. Here white cuts a potential line. 1 c6, b takes c6, 2 rook b5, a takes b5, 3 b7, and nothing can stop the pawn from queening. White controls the long diagonal. But how does white take advantage of black's stretched defenses? Correct. Both the queen and the rook are guarding e8, but are also trying to guard h4 and g7 respectively. Hence, 1 rook e8, queen g5, after 1 queen takes e8, 2 queen h4 checkmate, or 1 rook takes e8, 2 queen g7 checkmate, 2 queen h8 check, rook takes h8, 3 rook takes h8 checkmate. Note that 2 rook takes g8 is too slow, in view of 2 queen c1 check with mate to follow. Discovered checks, forcing threats, destroying defenders. This schematic illustrates a familiar position in the Petrov defense. Black has mistakenly played knight takes e4, 1 queen e2, knight f6, the worst idea, 2 knight c6 check, winning the queen. But if black tries to hold the knight at e4 with 1 f5, d5, white wins at least a pawn with 2 f3. The hole at f6 is an invitation to mayhem on the black squares. 1 knight f6 check, king h8, 2 knight d7 check wins the queen. Note that 2 knight e8 check guarding g7 does not lead to mate at g7 because black simply interposes the pawn to f6. The best discovered check of all is a double check with a point. Black cannot interpose on the checking line or capture the checking pieces. Here is the famous smothered mate, which occurs frequently in practice, mostly as a threat. 1 queen a2 check, king h8, 2 knight f7 check, king g8, 3 knight h6 check, king h8, 4 queen g8 check, rook takes g8, 5 knight f7 checkmate. When the battery fires, the leading piece can choose artfully. Here is a typical mating sequence. 1. Bishop g6, check, king g8. 2. Queen h7, check, king f8. 3. Queen takes f7, checkmate. See the point of choosing g6 on the first move? Sometimes the battery is directed against a minor piece, trying to pin the leading piece in the battery. See level 6 for examples of other pseudo-pins. 1. Bishop takes f7, check, king takes f7, 2. Knight e5, check, followed by 3. Knight, queen takes g4. Note that 2. Knight g5 check is a mistake, even with a white bishop at c1 guarding that knight. 2. Queen takes g5, and both queens are in take, can be captured. How does white move immediately against the enemy king? Correct. Bishop takes h7 check is the start of many good mating attacks. Nothing else is fast enough. If 1. King takes h7, 2. Knight g5 check, king g8, 3. Queen h5 is the idea. Black can defend with 2. King g6. The second stage in tactics is going beyond responding to setting up combinations. Here white sets up a skewer. 1. Rook c8, queen takes c8. 2. Queen h8 check, king e7. 3. Queen takes c8. White seems to have run out of attacking ideas and is 2 pawns down. A simple forking combination sets things right. 1. Rook takes d7, queen f8, not 1. Queen takes d7 because of 2. Knight f6 check. 2. Knight f6 check, not 2. Knight g5, bishop d5, and the weak back rank will cost white a move and the game. 2. King g7, not 2. King h8, 3. Queen takes f7, and white will mate at h7, see level 5. 3. Queen c3. The potential discovered checks give white a lasting initiative. Queen sacrifices, the exchange sacrifice, pawns, minor pieces. Black's attack appears unanswerable, yet a queen sacrifice sets up a standard back rank mate. 1. Queen f8 check, king takes f8. 2. Bishop h6 check, king g8. 3. Rook e8 checkmate. It can't be said enough. Watch out for a weak back rank. The queen side is notorious for spectacular attacks on a castled king. This is one of the prettiest. The idea is to set up a discovered check. 1. Queen a8 check, knight b8. 2. Queen takes b7 check, king takes b7. 3. Bishop takes d7 check, king a6. 4. Bishop c8 check, king a5. 5. Bishop d2 check, king a4. 6. Rook b4 check, and 7. Rook a1 checkmate. One of the most famous positions in chess history is Anderson's immortal game against Dufresne in 1852. Black threatens mate, so every move must be a check. One, rook takes e7 check, knight takes e7. 2. Queen takes d7 check, king takes d7. 3. Bishop f5 check, King E8, 4 Bishop D7 check, King D8, F8, 5 Bishop takes E7 checkmate. Note also the interesting mate if 3 King C6, 4 Bishop D7 checkmate. The knight at F3 is pinned and the bishop at C4 attacked. What is White's best move? Correct. White wins a piece or checkmates with 1 Knight takes E5, Bishop takes D1, 2 Bishop takes F7 check, King E7, 3 Knight D5 checkmate. Legal played this first in the 18th century. A well-posted knight, such as the one at D5, is often worth a rook. White takes the wheels off Black's position with 1 Rook takes D5, C takes D5, 2 Knight takes F6, Bishop G6, 3 Bishop takes G5. Note the winning fork after 1 Rook takes D5, 2 Knight takes F6. The exchange sacrifice, rook for minor piece, often occurs at H5 against a kingside castled king, or at C3 against a queenside castled king. Here Black comes first. 1 Rook takes C3, 2 B takes C3, Queen A5. Note that there is no gain of material, simply a weakening of the king position and the frightful threat of 3 E4 after 3 King B2. General positional considerations, such as control of dark squares or better knight placement, often cry out for the exchange sacrifice. 1 Rook takes D4, C takes D4, 2 Knight E4 with a complicated game. If 2 Knight E5, then 3 Bishop H6 and 4 Rook F1. The threat to win the exchange with a fork by the Black Knight at B4 is a common theme in the early endgame, especially with queens off the board. Here White can try for more than pedestrian defense, 1 King D1. 1 Bishop F4, Knight takes C2 check. White gains a move if 1 King E7, 2 King D2. 2 King D2, Knight takes A1. 3 Bishop takes D6 check, King G8. 4 Bishop takes B5, regaining the piece with a great lead in development. White has the 2 bishops. Does White have a better move than 1 Queen takes H6, regaining a pawn and threatening 2 Rook F5? Correct. The forceful way to end matters is 1. Rook takes d7, knight takes d7, 2. Rook takes f6. The second exchange sacrifice denudes the king. 2. Knight takes f6, 3. Bishop takes f6, queen d7, 4. Queen takes h6, with mate to follow. The b and g pawns are the most vulnerable in the opening, and are commonly sacrificed to gain time. Note that typically a knight must be available at c3, c6, f3 or f6 to support a rook at b1, b8, g1, g8. 1. Kingside castle, queen takes b2, 2. Rook a, b1, queen a3, with a lead in development. A standard French defense. Is g7 weak because the black bishop has moved? 1. Queen g4, knight f6. 2. Queen takes g7, rook g8. 3. Queen h6, rook g6. 4. Queen h4, knight takes e4, with a good game for black. Here is a schematic depiction of a frequent pawn sacrifice on rank 6 or 3. 1. e6, f takes e6. 2. Knight g5. The idea in such positions is to delay the development of the bishop and establish weaknesses at e6 and f7. This schematic illustrates a pawn sacrifice to gain a strong position for a minor piece. 1. e5, f takes e5, 2. Knight e4, and the knight is strongly posted against the black bishop. Minor piece sacrifices, knights and bishops, open doors to mating attacks. Even if a mate is prevented, the attacker can often recover 2 to 3 pawns because of the exposed position of the king. Here the attack comes out of the blue. A famous Karpov mate in 3. 1. Knight f3, check, g takes f3. 2. Rook g6, check, king h1. 3. Knight f2, checkmate. A quiet rook sacrifice threatens mate in a most unusual way, and a deadly fork shows that it's really no sacrifice at all. 1. Rook g2. 2. King takes g2, knight e3, check. 3. Knight takes d1. When a piece merely has to clear a line or a square to create a strong threat, it becomes a desperado, one who cares nothing for its life, only for choosing the right square. 1. Queen e8, rook a takes e8, 2. f7 check, rook g7, 3. f takes e8, promotion to queen, checkmate. The queen move prevents rook a f8, which is why 1. Queen f8 is wrong. Now start from the elements of a famous combination. See how a world champion visualizes a winning sequence of moves. 1. Knight g3 extricates the knight from danger and threatens the fork. 2. Knight takes e2, check. As the position builds up in reverse slow motion, notice that even though the black queen is in take, 1. Knight takes g3 is an in-between move, Zwischenzug, that says, pardon me, but I'll take a pawn first instead of dealing with my queen. Two moves further back, this is how Karpov viewed his game against Timon. Black can play 1. Knight takes f1, c5 takes d6, 2. Knight takes g3. Black could, of course, play 1 bishop takes c5, but then the pin is off the g3 pawn, and white simply takes the knight at h2. The Zwischenzug is a suspension of reality that makes combinations possible. Here is the position after white's 15th move in this Montreal 1979 game. See Classic Game 131. Black had to visualize the previous position to play the piece sacrifice. 1. Knight takes h2. 2. King takes h2. White makes a Zwischenzug instead of the prosaic 2. King takes h2, Queen h4 check, 3. King g1, Bishop takes g3, 4. F takes g3, Queen takes g3 check, 5. King h1, Rook e6, when white will soon be mated. The Karpov-Timman game went as follows. 1. Knight takes h2, 2. c5, Knight takes f1, 3. C takes d6, Knight takes g3. White is ahead in development, but appears to be about to lose a pawn, the usual poisoned pawn at g2. 1. Bishop takes g7, Queen takes g2. Black sees only 2. Bishop f3, Rook e8, check, remaining a pawn up. 2. Queen d4, Queen takes h1, check, 3. King d2, Queen takes a1, 4. Queen f6. Now there's nothing to do about 5. Bishop h6, and mate to follow. A famous double rook sacrifice by the former women's world champion Nona Gaprindashvili. The double bishop sacrifice is always possible when the king's natural defender, the knight, is lured away and a rook can readily move to rank 3. 1. Bishop takes h7, check, instead of 1. Queen takes h5, g6, and black can organize a defense. 1. King takes h7, 2. Queen takes h5, check, King g8, 3. Bishop takes g7, King takes g7, 4. Queen g4, check, King h7, 5. Rook f3, with mate to follow. This was Emanuel Lasker's first memorable victory, Amsterdam, 1889. White has an advanced pawn. How does white dislodge the black queen? Correct. 1. Bishop a3, Queen takes a3. White's pieces have few other moves. How does white move the pawn to the queening square? Correct. If you tried 2. Queen c7 check, you would be rewarded with a mate after 2 King f8. But black escapes with 2 King h6. Also 2 e7 is met immediately by 2 King f7. So 2 Knight h5 check, g takes h5, 3 Queen g5 check, King f8, 4 Queen takes f6 check, King g8, 5 e7. After several checks, the white king was safe and black, Capablanca, resigned to Botvinnik. See Classic Game 82. Pawns and strong points, development and control, transitions. Chess strategy begins with the initial moves of the game. Here both sides play to open the lines for their bishops and queens. By playing the double move instead of e3 or e6, they keep the potential line of the queen's bishops also open. Since the knights have fewer options than bishops, it's generally better to develop them first. In the opening or middle game, the first rule is to keep all possible options open. 2 f6 would have been poor because of 3 knight takes e5, queen e7, not 3 f takes e5, 4 queen h5 check, and white soon wins material or checkmates. 4 knight f3, queen takes e4 check, 5 bishop e2, and white has a big lead in development. 2 bishop d6 would also have restricted black's development, blocking the d pawn and impeding the queen's bishop. White threatens to undermine the knight's defense of the e pawn. However, it is immune as long as white's e pawn is also vulnerable. For example, 3 bishop b5 a6, 4 bishop takes c6, d takes c6, 5 knight takes e5, queen e7, regaining the pawn. By continuing to develop normally, black keeps the balance in the center. The squares d4, d5, e4, e5. A move like 3 queen f6 is premature, because the queen can do little damage this early in the game, and is easily harried by minor pieces. 4 knight c3, threatening 5 knight d5. White's e4 pawn is protected by the rapid mobilization of the rook in castling. If 5, knight takes e4, 6, rook e1, f5, 7 d3, and black's e5 pawn will fall. White usually plays 6 d4 here because the knight will be pinned on the e-file if 6, e takes d4. How does white get a better pawn position? Correct. The idea is 7, bishop takes c6 check.
7, b takes c6, 8, d takes e5. To avoid losing a pawn, black must now play 8, bishop takes f3, 9, queen takes f3, d takes e5. Black's queenside pawns are now weak, the a pawn isolated and the c pawns doubled. White now mobilizes rapidly. 10, rook d1, bishop d6. 11. Bishop g5, rook b8.
White controls more space and has a better pawn structure. How should white guard b2? Knight d2. If 12, rook takes b2, then 13, knight c4, rook takes c2, 14, queen d3 would win the exchange. The rook is badly placed after 13, rook b5, 14, a4, rook c5, 15, queen d3, followed by 16, bishop e3. Black chooses to get the king to safety rather than take the pawn at b2. But now the d6 square is seriously threatened. 12, kingside castle, 13, knight c4, rook e8. The most difficult challenge of chess is to work out a plan of action in a fairly level position. Is the black king position weak enough that 14, rook d3, followed by 15, queen f5, and 16, rook g3 might succeed? Or should white go after the weak a pawn with 14, queen c3, and 15, queen a5? Rook d3. Here's a good example of keeping options open. This move threatens to double the rooks on the d-file. 14, queen c3 shows that the knight is not always pinned. 14, knight takes e4. How does black defend against 15, rook a d1? 14 rook e6, 15 rook a d1. Now black threatens to get free, finally, with 15 h6. Rapid development, open lines, and early castling are often rewarded in bright combinations. Here, white has sacrificed a piece to trap the black king in the center, in a state of cramped but apparent solidity. For the full game, see Classic Game 4. White first reduces the defenders. 1. Rook takes d7, rook takes d7. 2. Rook d1, queen e6. 3. Bishop takes d7, check. Knight takes d7. 4. Queen b8, check. Knight takes b8. 5. Rook d8, checkmate. This brief instruction ends with an immortal game of Paul Morphy.